For some of you who don't know Beverly Mack, I want to share a little bit about her background. Many of you do know her. Dr. Mack is an internationally celebrated author and scholar of African studies and African cultures and literatures. She received her MA and PhD from the University of Wisconsin-Madison in African languages and literature. She's held faculty positions at George Mason University, Yale, Georgetown, Bayero University in Nigeria, and fortunately for us, she spent most of her career at the University of Kansas as a professor of African and African American studies, retiring just very recently before the pandemic. Dr. Mack has published, co-authored, and co-edited, are you ready for this? A record 7 books. 7, I'm not making this up, 7 books, focusing on women's literature, religious practices, and education in Nigeria. I spent some time with her CV, and she's published almost 40 other book chapters and articles and another 60 plus minor publications like book reviews. I sometimes wonder how you were able to do all of this in one career instead of 3. It was remarkable. Dr. Mack speaks 5 languages. She's conducted decades of field work in Africa, and she was awarded several outstanding teaching awards at KU. She's given hundreds of guest lectures, invited talks and workshops for universities, professional associations, and community groups, both in the US and internationally as well. Her list of internal and external grants and fellowships are too numerous to mention, but they include grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities, and I think I counted 5 NEHs. She has received funding from the Carnegie Corporation, the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and 2 Fulbright Hays fellowships. As with the project we're going to talk about today, Dr. Mack has also donated and curated countless materials from her research to archives at the Smithsonian, here at KU, the University of Pittsburgh, and Harvard. Her work and materials are going to serve countless generations of scholars in African studies, gender studies, and literature because of that. And on a personal note, which I hope is okay to share, she's also just a kind and fun human being. She's fun to go to dinner with. And I think of her, whenever I think of Beverly, I think of her sending good energy out into the universe. One personal memory is that Beverly knitted my child a beautiful blanket soon after we adopted her. And then that same blanket became my mom's favorite shawl when she moved in with us, as she was passing away. And so I love that this blanket that you knitted for us, Beverly, was on both generations, for me, my child and my mother. And every time I saw it, I always smiled and thought Beverly was there giving them hugs. So it was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And today we're here to celebrate the most recent book, which is beautiful and fantastic. It was published last year, Equals in Learning and Piety, Muslim Women Scholars in Nigeria and North America. For those of you at KU, we have hard copies and electronic copies of the book at KU libraries. And for those of you outside KU, you can find it from the University of Wisconsin Press or whatever independent bookstore you purchase your books from. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at this book. I have read it, and it is filled with bookmarks and earmarks. So it is a phenomenal read. I am in awe of everything that is in this book, just absolutely in awe of that. So I wanted just to start a little bit to give you just a taste of the book and how it came to be. I think this is amazing content. It's an insightful prose. It has clear honor and respect for the women of Nigeria and their role in shaping Islam and in shaping politics and history in Nigeria and abroad. I also think of it as a journey of trust and a journey of collaboration and partnership that speaks so well, Beverly, of what you have been able to build in terms of your scholarship and scholarly community. So I know most of you haven't read the book, but I hope by the end of this, you're going to go out and get a copy because it is phenomenal. So I thought I'd love for you to set the stage for us, Beverly, because you share this amazing story in the preface, and then the rest of the book unfolds from there. And you talk about the most unexpected beginning when your longtime collaborator and colleague, Jean Boyd, called you and presented you with what we could call an unexpected gift or an unexpected new responsibility. So could you just tell us a little bit first about Jean Boyd and how you had this decades-long collaboration, and then we'll get into more specifics about how this book came to be.
Okay, for those of you who have not read the preface in One Woman's Jihad, I will just recount that briefly because that is the prelude to this other story of the beginning of this last book. Um, I was in Nigeria in 1979 with a Fulbright grant. I had intended to go there to study women's poetry and performance, the court praise singers and other types of performance. And in the process of talking to a Hausa woman poet, I very naively said to her, "And how is it that your husband gives you permission to write this poetry?" And she sucked her teeth and said, "Did Nana Asma'u need permission?" And I said, even more naively and stupidly, "Who is Nana Asma'u?" Because there was nothing, I had done my homework, but there was nothing published on Nana Asma'u except a footnote in Hiskett's book, The Sword of Truth. And then she sucked her teeth a little more and she said, "Go to Sokoto, find Nana Asma." Well, Sokoto is like a 6-hour drive across the desert. And, but I'm an obedient cadet and I got in my car and I drove to Sokoto. And when I got there, I asked someone on the street where Nana Asma was. I got another incredulous look and they said, "Come, we'll take you to Jean Boyd." So they took me to the home of a British woman who had lived there for decades. I knocked on the door and again naively said, "Excuse me, I'm so sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for Nana Asma'u." And she said, "Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. You're about 150 years too late, but do come in and have some tea." So I went in and she explained to me that Nana Asma'u was a daughter of the Shehu Usman Dan Fodio, who had led the Sokoto Jihad from the early 1800s until about 1830. There were various end dates for various geographic places. And that this woman, Nana Asma'u, had written a lot of poetry, which Jean was familiar with, in the course of trying to learn Arabic and the Ajami, which is the Arabic script for Hausa language, for any other languages. She had been given one of these poems by the Waziri, who was a very important aide to the Sultan of Sokoto. And he said, "Start with this, you will learn." So in the course of her studying, she discovered there was an entire collection of poetry by this woman that she, having lived in Nigeria since the 1950s, had never known about. Um, I, as a researcher looking for women's poetry, I'm like going out of my mind and so excited about this, and having just had a field methods course before I left that insisted that you should always protect your material, make sure you send copies home, so that if anything happens to one set, you have no. And I say to her, "Oh, this is amazing. Do you have these?" And she said, "Yes, just pull that box out from under the sofa." So I pulled out the box and there was this collection. And I said, "Oh my goodness, surely you have copies somewhere else." And she said, "No, those are the only copies I have, but they should be fine." I said, "Aren't you worried about these?" And she said, "Well, when the house caught fire last year, I was a little concerned, and I'm just beside myself with excitement and dismay all at once." Jean, at that point, which was 1979, was just about to retire and go back to England. And I, of course, having had this extraordinary meeting, drove myself back to Kano, carried on with my work, came back to the United States and sat down in 1980 to write my dissertation on House of Women Poets and Performers, which is what that book, Muslim Women Sing, is all about. And then I went back to Nigeria to do postdoctoral research, collected more material, came back to the United States and worked at one place or another until a few years later, I was at Yale and they had just purchased the microfiche of all these poems of Jean Boyd's collection. Hi, Peter, of Nana Asma'u. And I was so excited. So the librarian bought them. I looked at them. I could not make heads or tails of them because they were just all photographs. Some had dates, some did not. Some had translations, some did not. So I wrote to Jean, who had retired to the Lake District. And I said, Don Allah, let me write a grant proposal so that you can publish these, because I want to use these in my work. She said, sure, that's fine, whatever you want to do. Thinking I would go away. And I just never go away. So I intended to write a grant proposal for $10,000 or something. It was an NEH grant. And then I learned that American money couldn't really go directly to a British person, obviously. So I had to be involved. And I had missed the deadline. So I didn't tell her I had missed the deadline. I found another NEH grant for and wrote that for a collaborative project for the two of us. With my history background, I would do the historical background to each poem, the footnotes, all of that, and she would do the other stuff. And it turned out to be $120,000 and provided for 2 years of our work together. And that is what funded the publication of this book. So it was an NEH grant that allowed for all of these to be in English with the venue, the source, the language, and then at the back, all the manuscripts in Ajami or Arabic. Most of them are Fulfulde and Hausa Ajami, and some in Arabic. So this was a primary source that I thought was really important to the field, and we got that done. And then colleagues said, well, this is great as a doorstop, but really, can you do something we could use in classes? Okay, so then we
Don't you love it when colleagues make those kind of comments?
Thank you so much.
Like you've put this out in the world, and it's like this. It's a permanent feature for everyone to use.
Right, and to ask for more. So this short volume has 5 different chapters with samples from Asma'u's work based on particular disciplinary perspectives: anthropology, religious studies, gender studies, and so on, literature. And this was something that colleagues could use for case studies. So that was good. And we were done with that, and that was fine. And then Jean wrote to me and said, oh, a publisher wants me to do some material. Will you work with me on this? And the result of that in 2013 was this, which is Educating Muslim Women. And this involved a great deal of material that did not fit in the first book or the second book. So that was a useful addition. So the 3 of them, we've got Nana Asma'u here, right? And we were all done with that. And then, and I'm getting to the point to answer your question, Jean, I thought we were all finished. And Jean wrote to me in 2014, and she said, I need you to come see me. Come to Penrith. So I thought, okay, when Jean calls, I go. So I went to Penrith, and she sat me down with a table full of manuscripts, poems, interviews, historical pieces, all these works, all this material that she had kept since the 1950s in her files, and she didn't know what to do with. And she looked at me and she said, do something with these. So
I can't, I mean, I can't even, like, when you say that, I can't even imagine the responsibility and
yeah,
also just the horror of it all too, right? What do you do? Like, where do you start?
so thank God for technology. I got my little iPad and I took photographs of everything, because otherwise we would have been at the photocopy shop forever and I would have needed 3 suitcases to carry it all home. Um, Printed it all out when I came back to KU and started looking at what I could do with it, how I could organize it, because as you can imagine, um, from this book, or if you can't, you will by the time we're done. This book has in it a multiplicity of kinds of materials. There are poems, there is history, and in addition to all Jean stuff, there is all kinds of information. Jaji Mariam and Angel, glad to see you both there, about Pittsburgh and the women in Pittsburgh who are doing what Nana Asma'u did, but on this side of the ocean. So within a year, I had a draft for Jean, and I started writing to her. And I had worked with this woman for 3 books, many years. I had by now known her for several decades, and um, I didn't hear anything back. I had questions. There were big gaps because this was her material, and I couldn't answer these questions, and I got no answers. And so I realized something was wrong, and then heard that the veil had begun to fall over her memory, and her daughters informed me of that. So I knew I was on my own, and I could only do what I could do, and then leave in the footnotes and in commentary um, some guideposts for anyone who came after me who wanted to and was able to investigate certain aspects of this a little more deeply. So I that is the story of this. I think this book represents maybe the 6th draft of this book that I wrote between 2014 and the present. So it's the whole last 10 years. Um, and many people have read the full manuscript, portions of the manuscript, and their input has been really valuable. And it is what it is. And I hope that scholars after me will, pick up from here and investigate more. But I have to say, this is the book I wish I had read before I went to the field. And and
I,
for
I can
me,
s- I can see that, right? I can see that when you read it. For me, it pulls together, and I don't know anything about most of these fields, and I, even as a novice, I can follow. There are clear through lines, which I encourage you all to read. I am in awe of the way that you wove together a century and a half of history and religion and women's roles in the struggle uh, and poetry. I mean, it has very definite moments within the book and different geographies and scopes. Yet there's a cogent whole. Like, I really feel like, for me, I left the book feeling as though I had a very good sense of women's roles in the educational movement in Nigeria and what that meant for the development of Islam, and the development of women's roles in Nigeria. Like, that's one of the things I left the book with a much better sense of, that I really had no idea. So I can imagine this would be the book. Like, I want all of my students to read it before they go into whatever field they're going into. But what are some of the other big, we've talked about this a little bit, some of the, like, if you could encapsulate like your 3 big contributions you hope people will take from this.
right. First and foremost, I wanted a place where I could put the poetry that Jean had preserved, because as we've learned from the Timbuktu study, and on the other end of it, as we've learned from what Boko Haram has been doing, um, there is so much out there that is so at risk. And I mentioned in here, I have seen the manuscripts in the library in Rabat that are brought to you, and you open them up and they're just lace. They are entirely eaten by worms. I know that in the Sokoto History Bureau, there are stacks and stacks of manuscripts with the windows open and the harmattan, or the hot Sahara air coming through, and they're just crumbling. So, as I say in here, the poetry that is in here, and more importantly, the originals that KU has preserved on the archive, for which you have a link multiple times in this book, those written in Ajami that are in Fulfulde that need translation, or in Arabic that still need translation. All of those poems in English, in Arabic, in Fulfulde, in Hausa, are primary source materials, and they needed to be preserved and they needed to be made available to the public somehow. And this was a home for them. So together with this book, there are lots of other supplemental poems by other women, because Nana Asma was not the only poet, not the only woman who was erudite, who was educated, who was prolific in writing things. So primary source material preservation, that's the first thing. The second thing is a history of the Yantaru from the beginning to the present time. And that had not been written anywhere. And especially for the women in Pittsburgh, hi, Sean, for the people in Pittsburgh, this is really important in terms of knowing where the Yantaru originated, what its aims were, what its curricular materials were, so that they can know how to choose what portion of that is useful to them in this day and age. So that's the second thing, history of the Yantaru. The third thing is most important to me, and that is a revised view of women's roles and their importance in West African history. I mean, we've read lots and lots and lots of materials on the Sokoto Jihad, the Sokoto Caliphate. Have we read anything about women being instrumental in the success of that caliphate? Nothing. Nothing. And I'm here to say that you can fight all the battles you want on the battlefield, but if you don't take care of re-socialization in the home and in the community, then what you fight for will not cohere. What you fight for will be forgotten. So it is the women, I argue, that are responsible, the women who are responsible for the success of the Sokoto Caliphate by the perpetuation of the Yantaru, and what the poetry and the education in the Yantaru movement taught about the reason for the jihad and the purpose of the caliphate.
That's excellent. I mean, it's hard to bring a book together and like a couple of key points, but I think you really did it, and that was a great summary. I'm wondering if we could spend a little more time even with that last one, because I was struck throughout the book of how you were able to delineate how knowledge becomes power for these Muslim women, right? Throughout history, through a century and a half, right? How education became a place of authority and equity, right? And that's a history that's, as you said, had not been written, had not been talked about in those particular ways. A couple of lines from chapter 5 I wanted to share that stood out to me. Against a proclivity for entrenched patriarchy, however, women found their voices in the Quranic command to pursue knowledge, and they were undaunted in that pursuit. And then a few lines later, Muslim women's intellectual engagement was not a hobby. It was central to their spiritual well-being. You have similarly strong assertions throughout the book, from chapter 2 all the way through the end. And I'm just wondering, you now have put in one place the empirical work that proves this. But can you say a little bit more about how essential women were in the development of Islam, how central this was for women's position in Nigerian society then and now, if you have some additional thoughts?
Yeah, what struck me in field research was how very confident Muslim women were about what they were doing. These are the women who were educated, who were knowledgeable about Islam, who taught their children. Um, they didn't need permission from anyone. And it wasn't a matter of power, it was a matter of authority. And the authority was vested in them in Islam, in the original source, in the Quran. Um, Haji Abba in the palace, one of the royal wives, used to say to me, women need to know how to read so they will know their rights. And at first, I didn't understand the magnitude of her perspective and her comment. But as I got to know the women poets with whom I worked, and as I got to know more about Asma'u, and as I studied more about Asma'u's sisters and the Fodio family, I understood that their first devotion and their last devotion and the focus of everything was Islam, was their spiritual concerns and the way they lived their life in the world. It was beyond the importance to them of their spiritual life, went beyond their daily concerns, and they always seemed to understand things in the largest context of spirituality. It was a real lesson for me. And so these women who were poets were focused, and even the women who weren't focused, like Haji Abba in the palace, she was educated, and she knew that she was not subordinate to any man. She was an equal in learning and piety, which is a quote from Hiskett, a colleague. Women in Islam who understand Islam know that every soul is equal, and that gender has no basis. Now, having said that, we have plenty of examples of individuals who want to subvert that perspective, but that is not what you learn when you read the Quran, and when you are a devout Muslim who understands the original sources. Islam is meant to provide an equal playing ground for everyone who wants to pursue spirituality. And these women understood that. And for many of them, many of the principal poets with whom I worked, they went through several marriages and divorces, and they had children, and all of that was fine. But the part that was consistent in their lives was devotion to Islam. They were absolutely confident in that, and that was their North Star. So I learned by their example.
It's still, I mean, it's still pretty radical though, right? Even though it's written, even though it is central, it's a core, it still can be quite threatening, I imagine, to patriarchies that exist there. I mean, how do people negotiate that tension today? That might be too big a question, but
It is a very big question. all I can say in response is that the ego gets in the way for a lot of individuals, and in a case of patriarchy, no offense, guys, but mostly male individuals, and the women I worked with um, just understood that they had to focus their attention on what they knew to be true through their own study, and not be upset by um, the control that men might try to have over them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could,
Islam is perverted in so many
so many ways.
places and so many cultures because of social conventions and individual egos. But the more you study Islam, at the heart of Islam, the more you understand that equality, equity
Mm,
is at the heart of it.
right.
Um,
Right. It's really helpful. It's really helpful. What can you tell us a little bit more about the Yantaro movement and what you learned through this project that you didn't know before the project?
right. Asma'u began the Yantaru program in the 1840s, in the aftermath of the Sokoto Jihad. And the aim was to educate women in the rural areas about Islam, about Islam that was not um, tainted by um, or perverted by local non-Islamic practices, pagan practices, and just social customs. So her aim was to educate the masses, but to start with the women. And when you educate a woman, you educate a whole family, so that then it grows exponentially. The good thing about this is that when Islam is practiced as it's meant to be practiced, there is equity for individuals. Um, and Haji Abba in the palace always would say to me, women need to study Islam so they will know their rights. So her point was, you need to read so that you can read it for yourself in the Quran, and not just rely on what your usually illiterate husband might tell you is the right way to behave. Um, so the Yantaru was begun as an education program, and it was a little different than education programs had been in Islamic history, in that the teachers went to the students in the villages, because the students were women uh, who were of an age bracket where they had to be with their children. They didn't have time to leave their home to go somewhere else and study. So the women who would travel to the villages were older women beyond childbearing years. And they would take these poems that we talk about in here and teach them to the women. Many of them were short enough to remember. And like there is one on the Quran that is, I think, 30 lines long. And it's got the name of every single of the one of the 114 chapters of the Quran in it. And then you unpack that. You just have them learn 30 lines. And then you say, oh, well, Fatiha. Well, let me tell you what that is. That is the opener. That is and there are many levels on which you can explain each chapter of the Quran, even without asking women to memorize those particular chapters. They just remember the index. So that is the That is the Yantara. And remind me where I'm going with this. What
No,
was
that's perfect. That's perfect. It actually takes me to the very next point I
okay?
wanted to go, which is I'm interested in how much of this book has you're also able to map sort of the migration of ideas, almost the diasporic movement of the Antara movement as well, right? And so I'd love to hear a little bit. We've been chatting a bit about Roxanne Panofsky's, I'm sure I butchered that name, her project, and if we could talk about that, and then I want to shift to the surprise chapter in the middle of the book going to Pittsburgh, right? So I'd love to hear about those sort of the movement of these ideas internationally. If you can do one or both, or
So the Yantaru began in the aftermath of the Sokoto Jihad, during the development of the caliphate, and before the British arrived in Nigeria. The British arrived, and the Yantaru movement of educating women in the rural areas continued because no one cared about those women in the rural areas. They were completely under the radar, and that was fine. And then, the school system came in, and that didn't even acknowledge the Yantar, which was fine. And then independence and the Yantar they continued under the radar until the present time, and they still are going on. Um, in the meantime, um, in the late 90s, and I should have Mariam Martin, who is on with us, talk right here. She's the judge in Pittsburgh. Someone introduced, Sharif introduced the women of the Pittsburgh Ummah to the concept of the Antaru. And he said, you women can be teaching yourselves. You don't have to rely on us men. There's a precedent here for that. So they began their own Yantaru movement using the materials that are in this book, using the poetry as lesson plans, doing their own newsletter. And because we are an itinerant society, women would move into Pittsburgh and out of Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, there are many, many different groups of Muslims, but this particular group in Pittsburgh follows Nana Asma'u's works and example, and they are learning the ethics that are conveyed through her works. So as women move into Pittsburgh and out of Pittsburgh, they start subchapters. And while it was the case in northern Nigeria that mature women would travel to the villages to educate women, here in the United States in the 21st century, we have Zoom. And women in Pittsburgh can set up classes with women who are in their town or in some other town in the United States, and learn about the principles of Islam as expressed in Nana Asma'u's 19th century materials, which are not at all dated. They're all still very relevant for us.
that's great. Miriam, did you want to add something here or ask a question since you're here from Pittsburgh?
Yes, Jaji Mariam.
Assalamualaikum.
Walaikum salam.
I just wanted to what can I add? I wanted to acknowledge how Dr. Beverly Mack has been a tremendous resource for us. And you kind of give context to Pittsburgh, but I think it's really important to just acknowledge the network. And the Yantaro has spread across the country. We have entities in Connecticut, California, like 3 different areas in California, Florida. We have a judge in France right now, Judge Delia. And as sisters migrate, make hijra to different places, we continue to stay connected. So right now, recently, a sister reached out who's living in Kuwait, and she has access to the resources. The Sankore Institute website has been, that's our sort of like virtual library where all the digitized manuscripts are housed. So everyone has access to that anywhere in the world. And it just continues to really evolve. And we have Judgy Angel on the call today. So we have leadership across the country, and we all kind of specialize in different areas and just kind of continue to kind of expand based on the needs of the community. So just happy to be here.
Thank you for that. I mean, it really is a tribute to just to see how this knowledge is continuing to spread. I think it's fantastic. Well, tell us about this London-based composer also, Beverly.
Wait, I wanted to get to that. I have a copy of her program from October 1st this year. But what happened was that last year, a woman contacted me. Her name is Roxana Panufnik. She is the daughter of a renowned Panufnik composer, and she composes liturgies. She composes choral music for religious contexts. And she said, I have learned about Nana Asma'u, and I want to set her elegy for Fadimatu to music for a choir in Bristol. And I was just amazed. This particular elegy, there are two in this book, there are two elegies for Fatima, and one is for a sister and one is for a niece. This particular one is the longer one for the niece who has died. And what it says, it encapsulates the aims of the Yantaru entirely, because it says that one should be concerned for one's spiritual life, not worldly concerns, attention to love for other people, and support of one's family. I wrote down some particular things I didn't want to forget: morality, ethics, the importance of humility, remembrance of our transitory nature, the pain of losing a loved one, which is sustained. Faith is sustained by faith in your creator. So even though you are sorry to lose someone, you have faith that this is the way it is meant to be, and it's all for good in the long run. So what was extraordinary about Roxana Panufnik's interest in composing the music for a choral group to use these words that Asma'u had written was that this Christian choral group found in this elegy the basic elements of faith. And it didn't matter whether it was Islam or not. So she's set this to music. It's, I think, a 6.5-minute long choral presentation with a call and response, which is in keeping with the artistic method of the day. And it educates people about Nana Asma'u. I mean, who knew? When she contacted me, I said, this is extraordinary. I mean, how is this happening in London? So it's, we say in Hausa, ikon Allah. It's just God's will. So.
That's excellent. I do have a couple more questions, but I actually wanted to open it up. I know some of you may or may not have read the book yet, but you might have some other questions for Beverly. So I want to create some space for you to ask or to make contributions or other additional thoughts. Yeah, Peter. Oh, Peter, I think you're still muted.
Can't hear you.
Can you unmute, Peter, or can I? No, I think it's just a little microphone. Yeah.
Okay.
Ah, I unmuted. Okay. Hi.
Beverly, first of all, it's good to see you.
You, Peter.
It would have been nice to see you in person in Lawrence. I don't know why you
Always
decided.
here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, sure. Hannah, thank you for bringing Beverly via Zoom. Can you tell us about the cover, the design? I know you're also an artist, so yeah, I think the cover may have an absorbing history. Talk to us about that.
Okay, yeah, thank you for asking. Right. I didn't plant this question, but Judge and Mariam, you will be very happy to know the source of this design. This, let me open it up. This image is the Hausa knot of the North. It is a graphic design that designates the Hausa people of northern Nigeria. So this design, the colors in it are colors that are chosen from designs that the Yantaro in Pittsburgh have in the artwork that they have developed. And specifically, Sheikh Sharif, who is one of the founders of the Ummah in Pittsburgh. So the colors and the symbol of the Hausa people are the most important parts of this book. And then what the designer did was to put tapestry or woven mat design up here. But these colors and the design are the important symbol. The other thing is that I tried in this case to be careful not to have any imagery. In here it's hard to see, but there is the image of a woman's face, which was not a very successful cover for many people. The lack of human image was important in this design, so it was just this symbol. Okay, so does that answer your question?
Sure, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Other questions? Thanks. Other questions?
I can ask another. How do men react to this knowledge?
Those who are good men with good souls react very nicely.
Okay.
What else could I say?
It's a good answer, Beverly.
No, I mean, really, seriously, those who are educated, who know about Asma'u, and who know her work, and I keep saying Asma'u because she was the focus of the first three books, but the aim of this book is to show you that Asma'u was not the only one. There are many, many other women who were teachers and poets and mystics, and their work is represented in here. And so the soul is the most important part. We say the soul has no gender. So a man who's true to that is very happy with all of this.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yes, Kathy.
So I'm wondering if I can phrase this well. The Yantaru and the teaching of women and families by women. Um, and it's in Pittsburgh, but this has all emanated from Nigeria and Nana Asma'u. Does any of this carry to Middle Eastern country Islam, or is there something similar that goes on there? Or is it underground?
This is a very good question for multitudes of subsequent scholars to answer. And I do not have a solid answer for you. I would look forward to other research materials from other people. But I do know that there are many instances of women teaching other women and following their own spiritual path in many other Islamic contexts. Now, you have in Islam a multiplicity of brotherhoods, the Qadariya, the Tijaniya, and on and on and on. And in each case, I think in multiple countries and therefore multiple cultures. So in each case, the extent to which women can be educated and educating will vary depending on the particular social dynamic of that place. So all we can do is look for particular case studies, which is really all that this is. And those case studies will overlap. What I did find, and you can read in the first couple chapters of this book, is that there is a long history of women involved in scholarship in a multiplicity of places. And those examples, whatever I could find, are given in the first couple chapters of this book. So this example is not a one-off example. It's not unique by any means. And women have been scholars and have been involved in Islam since the beginning of Islam. So there is precedent for it, history for it, and wherever that is not allowed, it's because someone who doesn't know the history of Islam is not allowing it. The aim in the origins of Islam is amassing knowledge. The idea is that the more knowledge you amass, the closer you can get to a sense of God, although you never really get there until you're not bound by this world. So knowledge is really important. And to answer your question, read the book and that chapter. But honestly, I don't mean to be sarcastic. There are lots of other examples of women scholars. In fact, Nadwi's study of women scholars in Islam is cited in here, and his book on this topic is a tiny little book where he gives a tiny portion of every example of the thousands of examples of women scholars in Islamic history. So it's really overwhelming and would depend on a person's access in terms of language ability and script reading ability and all of that. Does that answer your question?
That's great, Bev. And it will be on my to be read pile immediately.
It's great. And I think we just have like 3 more minutes, but I did want to, I'm daunted by the book, right? In terms of all of the scholarship that's in there, all of the different methods, the years that you're able to cover. If you were going to give advice to new scholars in this field, either in religious studies or Nigerian studies or African studies, what advice would you give in terms of building these types of partnerships and collaboration?
Yeah, here's a shout out for my my alma mater, University of Wisconsin, where we learned field methods that insisted on fluency in the language to start with, no use of interpreters. You know, we should make our own mistakes, which we all did. But the language is really key. And the whole Tower of Babel imagery becomes painfully clear when you're in the field and you say, you know, okay, well, I may be like fluent, however fluent someone who doesn't grow up with it can be in Hausa, but gee, I don't speak Fulfulde. But gee, I can read Arabic, but I'm not able to be fluent in speaking it. And the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. So the language is a real barrier, and the language is the key. The language is the door that you need to open so that you can have conversations with people. So if you're interested in all of this, you need the language, you need the access by actually going somewhere. Now, northern Nigeria is not an easy place to be right now. In fact, some of the Yantaru groups with whom I've been in touch recently are not able to meet. Politics create barriers, so that's a difficulty. But the language, the geographic proximity, and an understanding of the history, not just history of Islam, but history of the region, gender politics, all of that. So learn as much as you can about everything that you can and do it fast.
Love it. Love it. And that just filters right into the NRC grants that we need to write to keep that going.
Without which I couldn't have done.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you so much, Beverly. Thank everyone for being part of the conversation. Again, I highly recommend it as someone who didn't know pretty much anything before I read this. I love the book. I absolutely love it. I learned a ton. It's a fantastic way. So we'll have more brown bag talks. Charlotte, I'm not sure you'll get emails once you've registered for this one, we'll send lots of emails to you. So again, thanks, Beverly.
Thank you for the opportunity, and it's so wonderful to see all your smiling faces and your smiling names where there are no faces. So thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.